Welcome everyone to this final session of the Grand Multiliteracy event. And I'm very honored to welcome Dr. Jim Cummins as part of this event. Thank you very much for being here with us to talk about the benefits of multilingual literacy. So just to introduce Dr. Cummins, although I'm pretty sure many people don't need an introduction, but he's a Professor Emeritus at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education of the University of Ontario. Of Toronto, sorry. His research focuses on literacy development in educational context, characterized by linguistic diversity, and has been influential in establishing the theoretical foundation underlying bilingual education for minoritized students. He was one of the authors of the California State Department's volume entitled Schooling and Language Minority Students, a Theoretical Framework, and then elaborated on this framework in his book titled Negotiating Identities, Education for Empowerment in a Diverse Society. And this book is on free downloads. I'm going to leave the link in the description below, but you can read it for free. And also Dr. Cummins, Cummins' research has emphasized the intersections of societal powers relations, teacher-students identity negotiation, and literacy attainment in multilingual classrooms. His most recent book is entitled Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners, a critical analysis of theoretical concepts that was published by the Multilingual Matters in 2021. And he's also generously giving away a copy of this book. So if you want a chance to win it, you can enter the giveaway. Again, it's in the program. All the expressions are in the program of this event. So welcome, Dr. Cummins, and thank you very much for being here, because I know you're not at 100% of your form. You have a sore throat. So if we need to cut short, just let us know if it becomes a bit difficult.
Yeah.
And is there, first of all, is there anything you would like to add for your introduction?
No, first of all, let me just say thank you, Yoshito, for the invitation to be part of this this event. I very much enjoy the opportunity to talk about these issues, and I think you've captured most of what I've done over the last decades very, very well. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Okay, and thank you very much for accepting this invitation to be here. Because multilingual literacy is a topic that's sometimes a bit left on the side, or it's a bit subtopic. It's quite an important one, and it's great to be able to talk about it with you. So you have worked a lot with schools on creating policies to help multilingual children feel valued and empowered in schools. Could you first summarize the issues that you have worked on, and then explain the types of issues, if there's still some nowadays that exists?
Okay, I first started to work on these issues in the early 1970s when I was doing my doctoral research at the University of Alberta in Canada. And at that stage, there was a widespread perception that there had to be some costs associated with bilingual education or with second language immersion programs. And this was a time when French immersion programs were spreading quite rapidly across Canada. They had been started in the mid-1960s near Montreal, and the rationale behind starting these programs was that this was a way to enable children from Anglophone backgrounds to acquire knowledge of French, which is the dominant language and majority language in Quebec. And typically, these programs stayed in French through kindergarten, age 5, and grade 1, and then English was gradually introduced between grade 2 and grade 5 until it was about a 50-50 program. And despite the fact that the initial evaluation of this program seemed to show that there was no cost that anybody could discover through the evaluation related to spending maybe 65% of the time through French rather than English, French being children's second language. There was still widespread concern that there must be some costs hidden someplace. And this concern spread to, was very evident in the case of children from immigrant home backgrounds, where even though there was grudging acceptance that, okay, maybe for children from the dominant group, a second language bilingual education program might work okay, but children from immigrant home backgrounds who spoke Spanish or Chinese or some other language in the home, they needed maximum exposure to English if they were going to do well. And so it was very common at this stage to have to hear teachers and educational psychologists and other educators advise parents that they should switch to English in the home if they wanted their children to succeed academically. And this seemed to make sense to a lot of parents. The only problem was many of them didn't speak very much English. And so this was the context in which I got involved in in these issues. My dissertation looked at children at grade 6 level in a French-English bilingual program. And it seemed to show what some other studies had shown before this, that there were some subtle cognitive benefits associated with becoming bilingual and biliterate. And over the years, this finding has come up over and over again, so that by now, I think there's widespread agreement that there are at least some cognitive benefits associated with developing bilingualism and biliteracy. And there's also no debate anymore, at least among people who have informed themselves about the issues, about the legitimacy of bilingual education, that children can be educated through a minority language for 50% of the time or more in some cases. And if the program is implemented well, there are no costs associated with achievement in the majority language or societal language. And so my research is focused on these issues, and I'm looking at not just the psycholinguistic issues related to bilingual education and the transference of knowledge and skills across languages, but also the social justice issues related to this. Like, to what extent is it ethically acceptable to give children from immigrant home background, give parents of children from immigrant home backgrounds advice that is patently false in relation to what we know from the research? And yet this still happens in a lot of cases. I was at a conference a few days ago in Belgium, in the Flanders, a Dutch-speaking area of Belgium, and the policies in that area are still very much ones directed at prohibiting children from immigrant backgrounds from using their home language in the school or on the playground. And so we still have a ways to go in relation to widespread acceptance of what the research is saying. And so, you know, that's where I am right now. I'm doing similar kinds of research and advocacy to what I was doing 40 years ago.
Wow. Okay, so it still carries on, but it's surprising to think that in a country like Belgium that's multilingual, there is still that kind of attitude towards multilingualism.
It's, you know, it's hard sometimes for people to separate what's ideology from what's research, and there's a kind of a body of common sense that says if you want children to do well at school, if they don't speak the school language at home, then that's going to limit the amount of time through the school language, and the less time they have through the school language, the less well they're likely to do. That seems very common sense. The only problem is it's totally at variance with what the research is saying.
Okay. So do you think it's misinformation regarding the research, or is it that what's logical in their mind is still what prevails, despite the research and everything we can show them?
Yeah, it's having been a researcher in this area for more than 40 years. Okay. I'm quite skeptical about the power of research to convince people that their ideologies are wrong. You could look at any number of issues. If you look at climate change right now, and the evidence all around us that this is accelerating, with sometimes devastating impacts on the environment and on people's lives. In the United States, probably at least 50% of the people in the United States don't accept that climate change exists. So when you have kind of a covert or overt anti-immigrant orientation within a society or within a significant part of the society, then what you want to do is to make that diversity go away. And one way of making it go away is if immigrant children's languages were to disappear. If they came to school and suddenly were magically transformed into English speakers or Dutch speakers or whatever the dominant language is. And so there's, on the part of a number of politicians in countries in many parts of the world, there's the attitude that we have to convince parents of immigrant background that if they want to integrate into the society, they have to learn the society language just as well as native speakers. And if we want their children to succeed academically and learn the societal language, then if parents want that to happen, and every parent does want that to happen, they want their children to succeed, they also need to play their part and use the societal language at home. And so this mantra, if you like, is still very present in a number of contexts, much less so than it was, say, 30 years ago, but it's still there in many contexts. And it's, if I can just add something to that, it's not just sort of a right-wing, left-wing thing, not we're just conservative, progressive, though that is the way sometimes it falls out in some countries. In Canada, the most enlightened province, as far as language policy is concerned, is the most conservative province, namely Alberta. They have a widespread program of bilingual education involving, at this stage, about 11 different languages that's been going since the mid-1970s. It started off with Ukrainian English programs, 50% Ukrainian from kindergarten on and 50% English, and then it spread to other languages. And so the government at the time in Alberta was very sympathetic to the concerns of Ukrainian diaspora parents that they needed help from the school if they were going to maintain their language. And in a kind of prophetic perception, they saw what was happening in Ukraine and the Soviet Union during the 70s and before, as squeezing out, as suffocating the life out of the Ukrainian language, and the whole Russification process was taking place. And so the advocates for this program from the Ukrainian community honestly believed, with some justification, that places like Alberta, where there was a significant Ukrainian population, were the last hope to keep the Ukrainian language alive. And so it's, as I said, it's not just a right-wing, left-wing issue, but we, as researchers and also as parents and families, we need to cut through the various ideologies that are there and look at the research. And the research is really clear that if we want children to become bilingual or multilingual, if we want them to develop literacy in their home language as well as in English, we need to maximize the time that they spend through that language in the home in the early years, because that's really the only time where we have a lot of opportunity to spend time with children through that language, because the pressures on children to give up their home language for the dominant language are huge once they come to school.
Thank you very much. There's a comment from Uta Lima Horibond who is adding, so I guess, so talking about the fact that some schools or states are against bilingualism. So she says, I guess it also has to do with the monolingual bias that is threatening the well-being of bilingual and multilingual children and their families. So the monolingual bias, so thinking through the monolingual eyes, I guess.
Yeah,
And
it's not quite a monolingual bias, because if you look at many countries in Europe, for example, um, bilingualism and multilingualism is very much favored, so long as it's bilingualism and multilingualism involving European languages.
like in
It's
Belgium, for example.
Yeah, and people are very multilingual. Most Dutch people that I've met speak at least three languages, but it's that monolingual bias or orientation is directed at children from immigrant backgrounds, because there's concern about immigration in many European countries.
Yeah,
And so we've got a situation where what's being said, the subtext of a lot of policies, is that bilingualism is good for the rich but bad for the poor.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I've heard that a lot as well. So also what I wanted to ask you, because it's an event about around multilingual literacy, and most parents want their children to be able to read and write in their home languages. So we often think, okay, how do I do technically, how do I do this and that? But so in all your speeches and what you do, your research, there is a lot based on the emotional side of learning to read. And could you elaborate on what parents and teachers should pay attention to and put in place to make sure that our children can learn to read and write and develop their literacy effectively?
Yeah, and let me just first say that where it's possible for parents to develop literacy in the home language, that's a really powerful way of maintaining the language, because literacy provides roots to the language. It allows it to go deeper. If we want to extend our children's knowledge of their home language beyond just sort of everyday around the table conversation, then we need to have them reading books. We need to have them able to function in more formal as well as informal situations. And so literacy is a crucial step. And it's not always possible for parents to do that. Parents may not be literate themselves in the
Yeah.
home language. There may not be written versions of some home languages
Yes.
developed. It may be very difficult to get books or print material in home languages for some immigrant communities. But where it is possible, we should know that we should put every effort into helping children develop literacy in the home language. So how do we do it? Well, the first thing to know is that about 90% of children's brain development happens during the first 5 years of life. And so this is a crucial time for the expansion of children's intellects,
Yeah.
expansion of their language skills, their vocabulary knowledge, expansion of all aspects of the architecture of their brain. And so input that children get during this years is foundational to to the tools that they're developing to interact with the world. It's also a time when children are spending typically more time at home than when they go to school at age 5 or whatever age they go to formal schooling. And so uh, there's a huge amount of research showing that the extent to which there's an ecology of literacy socialization present in the home is hugely important for children's later development of literacy skills in school. And that applies to a monolingual situation as well as to a multilingual situation. So children who grow up in preschool environments, whether in the home or in daycare or whatever context they're in, where there's minimal exposure to print, where there's minimal listening to stories uh, in any language, uh, they tend to do much less well in developing literacy in school than children who have been exposed to what some people have called literacy saturation in the preschool years,
Yeah.
where they've been read to on a regular basis with parents or caregivers, where talk about books and discussion about books and fun with books is part of the everyday reality of children's lives. And in monolingual contexts, those children acquire literacy in the school language much more rapidly and much more effectively than children coming from a background where print has not been a prominent part of the interaction.
Mm.
And so Ideally, if we want our children to develop bilingual skills and biliteracy skills and multilingual skills, then we should take advantage of this time during the early years to expose children to stories in the home language, to books in the home language, to dramatization of these books in the home language, to drawing children's attention to how the language works, how the letters are formed. I'm not talking about formal teaching of phonics or anything like that, but just in the context of reading, draw children's attention to the directionality of print. For example, if we're talking about Arabic, it'll go from right to left, English left to right, to the alphabet, how different sounds in the alphabet are formed and how they look on the print. So all of this interaction is developing two things. It's developing children's concepts about print, their knowledge about how print works, but it's also developing an affective connection to print. They're having fun. They're with somebody who's important to them, that they love, and that they know the parent or older brother or grandparent, whoever it might be, loves them. So you're building up an affective connection to print that ideally, if the instruction in school is effective, will continue right through schooling. Because we know from the research that children who read a lot will become actively engaged with literacy in the school years, and going up into the secondary level, they do significantly better in terms of reading skills than children who read less. And as all of us know, there are pressures right now on children due to video games and screen time and all of the realities of the digital age that we're in or entering into. And so a lot of surveys have shown that children in a number of countries, particularly boys, are reading less than they used to 10, 15 years ago. And so we need to put effort into establishing that affective connection with print. And the preschool years are a terrific way to do it, but also in the school years, teachers have a major role to play in encouraging children to read, in making sure that there is a classroom library in the classroom where children can take books home to read with their parents, making sure that in the school there's a good school library. Ideally, if there are children from multilingual backgrounds in the school or in the classroom, we try to find books in those languages and to legitimize those languages in the school and to affirm students' knowledge of those languages and encourage parents to continue to develop those languages. So all of that is important. And it's not difficult to do in most contexts, but reading has become a very political subject in both the UK and the United States. There's a strong sense among some policymakers that really the only thing that's important is phonics. We have to focus on phonics, namely looking at the relationship or teaching children the relationship between the sounds of the language and how they're represented in print. And building up children's awareness of sound symbol relationships is obviously important, but it's not the whole story by any means. We have to promote children's engagement with print so that they want to read. They become part of what Frank Smith, reading researcher who passed away a couple of years ago, called joining the literacy club, where we set up a community, we establish a community that is in our classrooms, in our schools, where reading is something that we do and we enjoy and we exercise our intellects on and we talk about books. So all of that has happened in many, many contexts over the years, but it's under pressure right now because of misguided ideology that phonics teaching is a panacea for reducing disparities in children's achievement with literacy.
Thank you very much. It makes me think of, so you talked about literacy, the importance of literacy and creating this bond with children. And so at the moment, my son is in year 6, he's going to go to secondary school. So I'm visiting quite a few schools. And there is one school where, as part of the tour of the places we could see, there was the library. And they would explain that, so every week they have an hour in the library, they read for 30 minutes or something, and then it's treasure hunts, etc. so making it fun. But there was just one school who made it part of the tour of places to go to. And I think so this school is putting a lot of importance on the library and the activities they can do compared to other schools. And so that, I guess that's linked to what you said about creating this positive relationship with print, literacy, etc. And there are a few comments about, so I think it's a very an issue, a current issue as well. It's so Arabic Peace School who is commenting that she has a student who's learning Arabic who was told at school that it's not going to be important, so she doesn't need to take it in her A levels. A levels is the last diploma they get at in England, and she was discouraged to take this because it wasn't useful.
That is so absurd. I think you've got to call out that kind of ignorance and essentially discrimination. If the child is a speaker of Arabic, she or he has a huge advantage in terms of taking that language as an exam subject later on. And to say that Arabic is not useful in the world is so indescribably absurd. You're looking, I forget which rank it is in terms of number of speakers, but it's right up there in terms of the top 10 certainly. And so that kind of blind orientation to other languages other than the dominant language being not useful. Like Arabic for this child is going to be useful in speaking with his or her parents. It's going to be useful in speaking with grandparents who may not speak very much English. It's going to be useful in terms of job opportunities. You look at where a lot of the economic growth is right now, the economic activity, it's in Arabic speaking countries. And so, that kind of statement is maybe well-intentioned, but it's incredibly ignorant.
There's so many, it's really I don't know if it's objective or it's one side, a vision from one side that's imposed on others to say this is useful, this is not useful, because there is not just the academic professional side, it's all our rules, like you said at the beginning, that are important. And I know, for example, in my case, the reason I'm so passionate about multilingual literacy is because as a teenager, so I was going to an international school, but I couldn't read really well, read and write really well in Japanese. And it made me wonder as well if I could legitimately call myself Japanese. So I know it's not just about what you can do with the language, it's all the emotional side you have with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've done quite a bit of work with international schools and been at quite a few of the international schools conferences. And over the last 20 years, there's been huge growth in awareness in many of the international schools. And many of those schools are now leaders in looking at how children's multilingualism can be brought into the classroom as a tool for developing awareness of how language works, as a tool for becoming more sensitive about the geography of the world, as a tool for involving parents in their children's education. So there has been, I think, really noticeable progress within the international schools community in terms of valuing children's multilingualism. But your experience, Yoshito, is not uncommon at all, because in many schools, whether they're international or private schools or public schools, there isn't much knowledge about patterns of language development. There isn't much knowledge of bilingual development. And so when we look at the messages that are given to children in their school context, teachers may be benign in relation to children's languages. They may not be discouraging them from speaking those languages, but unless they're proactive, the dominant message that children are going to get is that only English matters, or whatever the dominant school language might be. And so the message that children are getting is, leave your language at the schoolhouse door, it doesn't belong here. And the effects of this are devastating. I live in Toronto, which is a very multilingual city. More than half the children in the school system come from non-English speaking backgrounds. And so Toronto can legitimately be described as a vibrant, multilingual, multicultural city, but it can also legitimately be called a linguistic graveyard. In Toronto, as well as many other cities around the world, languages come to school to die, because the pressure to belong to the dominant group, the pressure to give up one's language, which is something that makes you different, is all around. And it's not necessarily overt pressure. We've gone beyond the stage where children were punished for speaking their language. But unless there's an overt, proactive communication to children that their languages that they speak are intellectual accomplishments, that they provide huge increases in personal opportunity, in economic opportunity, and if they and their parents can put the effort into developing those languages as they go through school and developing literacy in those languages, then that's a huge advantage for children, and it's not going to have any negative effect whatsoever on their competence in the dominant language. In fact, the research suggests the opposite, that children who continue to develop their bilingual skills, who develop biliteracy or multiliteracy, are doing better in the dominant language than children who have given up their home language.
Yeah. And regarding what you said about languages coming to die in schools, it reminded me when I spoke to a head teacher in Canada, and he was Spanish speaking. He had a Spanish speaking family, and growing up in Canada, so he had two languages. So he came in school bilingual, and he says he left school monolingual, and that's why he's so passionate about multilingualism and everything. That he's trying to put a lot of things in place to keep his students' languages alive. It's like you said, unless it's proactive, it sends the message that it's not accepted, or English or whatever the majority language is more is the priorities, has a higher status.
Yeah, a lot of teachers will say, well, I'm one person in a class of 25 or 30 children, and there's 15 different languages represented in my classroom, none of which I speak. So I can't do anything with these languages. I'm positively oriented to them. I try to give positive messages, but there's no way I can do anything with these languages as part of my teaching. It's not part of the curriculum. And that, again, seems like a common sense position. But what's happened over the last 25 years is that there have been an increasing number of case studies highlighting what can happen when teachers and school principals encourage children to bring their languages into school. And this is one of the areas that I've been fortunate enough and privileged enough to work with many teachers on over the last 20 years or so. So children have looked at comparisons between their home language and English. They've written dual language books. They may write the book initially in their home language if they're literate in that language, and then the school finds ways to get from that language to English. There may be a teacher in the school who speaks that language that can help the child. There may be community members who could come in as volunteers to help make that transition. And right now we can even make use of things like Google Translate to give us a version, not necessarily a totally correct version in English of what children have written, but then we can look at that version of the child's story that he or she has written in the first language, look at the English version, and then have a group of children from the class work with the student on the English version to correct any mistakes that there might be and make sure that it represents what he or she wants to say. And so there's powerful instruction going on in schools that see children's languages as a resource. And I think we have many examples that we can look at. And probably the best way for teachers or parents or children themselves to look at what's possible in this context is to go to the website of a movement or a network that was started about 5 years ago by two people. One of them is a colleague of mine right now in Toronto, Emmanuel Pichon-Voorsman, and the other is based in the Netherlands, Ellen Rose Campbell, and they started up the language-friendly schools
I was going
network.
to refer to them. Yeah.
And it's a wonderful website. It's an inspirational website to go to and listen to teachers talk about what they've done, what their children have done, and that shows what's possible. So I'd advise anybody who's listening to check out the website. The webpage is languagefriendlyschool.org. That's all one word, and it's inspirational.
Yeah, it's great you're mentioning this this organization, because we had our first speaker of the event is working closely with that organization. He's called Jacob Hakon, and he showed us what it changes in students to accept, not just accept, use students' languages for their learning. So he explained that they went from a stage of welcoming, accepting the students' languages, but not doing much with it, to a stage where they're empowering their students by using in the classroom all their languages. So even if the teacher doesn't understand, they can still go plan some stages where they can use their home languages to be able to have a deep understanding of a subject, or have different angles they can look at a certain subject. So it enriches their learning. And so I guess this also answers, we have a question from Marilingo, who was asking, is there any training for teachers? Because many teachers maybe don't understand all the languages in the classroom. So I guess the website you just gave, so languagefriendlyschools.org, is a very good starting point to learn about this.
And what happens in schools that have moved in this direction, where they adopt a multilingual rather than a monolingual orientation, is that it becomes much easier to involve parents in children's education, because parents have a role in the school. They can come in, they can read stories in their home language. The stories can be translated into English or whatever the school language might be. And teachers also can learn some words of the languages that are represented in their classroom. For example, you could have every day of the week, we could start off the day by having a student bring in a word from his or her home language that is somehow meaningful to them. And the student explains why they brought that word in. They may write it down, or they may get their parents to write it down so they can show other children how it's written. And everybody in the class learns that word, including the teacher. And so the teacher shows that she or he can be a learner of languages also, can get some high frequency words, hello, goodbye, etc., in the languages of the students. And suddenly any resistance to learning English fades. There's a curiosity about language. Children want to learn aspects of each other's languages. When a newcomer student comes into the classroom in the middle of the year, children are curious about the student because they want to know what languages he or she speaks. And so you've got a whole transformation of the ecosystem in the classroom, where it becomes much more an exploration of linguistic realities and all of the realities associated with language, such as geography, like where do people speak Tamil, for example. It's an invitation to go to the map of the world and look at southern India and Sri Lanka, and students from a Tamil background can explain some of the history of the country. So there are major benefits for all children, including children in the classroom who speak only English, who may be monolingual in the school language. Their horizons are being expanded also. They are learning parts of other languages in a way that they would never do in a school that was a language unfriendly school, if we can use that term.
Thank you for this addition. So there are many parents who are following us as well. And I was wondering if you had any advice or do's and don'ts for parents, maybe avoid doing this because it can cause this or to families.
Yeah, I think the first thing that is important is that families talk about what they want to do with languages. If you've got one parent who speaks one language, another parent who speaks another, English might, for example, be a common language in the home because it's a common language between them, but they want their children to be able to speak to their grandparents on either side. So they'd love their children to gain access to, say, all three languages. Need to sit down and talk about it. What do we want to achieve? What do we want our children to be able to speak? How are we going to do that? If we want our children to be able to connect with grandparents who may be living quite far away, can we use social media or Zoom meetings to do that? So technology has opened up a lot of possibilities in the last 5 years or so. But I think it's important not to be too rigid. You know, there used to be an attitude that, okay, parents had to stick rigidly to the target language and kind of force their children to stick rigidly to that language. You know, that puts some negative associations together with the language. I think what most people who've done work in this area right now would recommend is have fun with languages. It's natural that children, if they're going to, for example, an English-speaking daycare or preschool program, they're not going to come back into the house with English words. If an older child is going and or has started school, they're going to bring English back in, and younger children will pick up English. So don't try and hide your children from the dominant language. Use it as a tool to expand both languages. What we know from the research, like the whole notion of interdependence across languages and transfer across languages, is that when the conditions are right, when both languages are viewed positively by teachers, by children, by parents, when children acquire a word or acquire a concept in one of their languages, that acts as a magnet almost for that concept to be learned in the other language. And so there's two-way transfer across languages. And so we need to create conditions where that can happen. And so, but again, I'll go back to one of the major things that can be effective: reading to your child or telling stories to your child or interacting, like talking about the books, asking questions about what's going on in the story that you're reading. Like, what do you think is going to happen next? You know, why do you think this character did what she did? This sort of interaction around stories is really powerful. And again, the early years are a time when we have an opportunity to expose the child to the languages we want him or her to learn. And reading and talking about books is a really powerful way of doing that. If we don't take advantage of that, when the child goes to school and they have maybe only some superficial knowledge of their home language, and English or the school language may have taken over quite a few of the functions, then it's going to be really hard to get children to build up that affective connection to the language, and English will take over really quickly. And as I said, we see that in Toronto all the time, and other cities too, where children will come to school at kindergarten, age 5, and by the end of grade 1 or beginning of grade 2, they've lost a lot of their fluency in their home language. They're embarrassed if they go to the supermarket and their mom starts speaking to them in the home language. They're embarrassed. They tell them, stop, don't use that language. And so sort of a certain shame gets built up even about the home language. And so we need to establish that pride, that sense of accomplishment and achievement, that the child is bilingual, multilingual. And so if we do that and use literacy as a tool to kind of root that both cognitive and linguistic and affective connection to the language, then it's going to be a lot easier to maintain that language despite pressures in the wider society.
It's interesting what you're saying about this role that literacy can play as well, because I thought about that before, like about the having pride in our languages, culture, so that our children are proud of it as well. But I didn't see the link between literacy, the role that literacy could play in all of this.
Yeah, it's if you think about what literacy does in any language, literacy expands horizons. Think about children who are reading extensively, like say uh, reading about life sciences, animals in kindergarten, grade one, or they're interested and passionate about dinosaurs. They're learning a huge amount about a lot of scientific concepts. Um, and so that's expanding vocabulary. That's also the more they learn, the more they want to learn. And so that's expanding their engagement with literacy. And if we can do that in two languages, then children are going to be reading more. And what they read in one language will stimulate them to read similar kinds of things in the other language. And realistically, in a context where English is the dominant language, that is going to be children's dominant language as they grow up. But if we can maintain a foothold and more than a foothold in the home language, so that children want to speak it, they're happy when they get a chance to speak to their grandmother or grandfather in that language. They're happy
Mhm.
in school to say that they're a speaker of this language and that they can write in this language. And if that is reinforced in the school context, that again fuels further engagement. So the school has a major role to play um, in terms of um, counteracting the sort of discomfort or sometimes shame that children may develop about speaking a language that's different from the school language, and also being proactive in enabling children to do powerful things in their two languages. And writing in the two languages is a great way of doing this. Writing dual language books, publishing these books, have them printed out in color, become a part of the school library or the classroom library, put up on the website, be part of a sister class connection with another class in a different country where we're
Mhm.
exchanging our creative writing in multiple languages. So there's the list goes on in terms of the creative instruction that can take place and has taken place in many classrooms where teachers adopt a positive multilingual orientation that affirms children's knowledge of other languages and makes them feel proud of speaking those languages. And as I said, the best place to start to look at what can happen when that orientation changes from monolingual to multilingual is the Language Friendly Schools network.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, it's true that reading books with books we have also other experiences that we can't experience right now. So for example, dinosaurs, we can't go outside and meet dinosaurs, but it brings that kind of vocabulary and the interest. So if it's in the home language or even if it's in the school language, it doesn't matter, but it brings this interest and the vocabulary. And like you said, the languages are interdependent. So if you learn about dinosaurs in school, but you want to talk about it to your parents, maybe you're going to ask how to say this, or you're going to say it in English, and they're going to be helping you say it in their home language. So yeah, books can, yeah, understand, they can bring the external additional experiences into our lives.
They also expand imagination. They get children, they give children ideas about what they can write about. They can have fun with books. Um, so, if that's happening in two languages, and if there's a kind of a reinforcement of both languages in the home and reinforcement in the school, that's the ideal environment for this development to take place. And as I said before, just to repeat the point, um, we know from a huge amount of research that there's three basic things that we need to take account of when we talk about literacy development, whether it's a monolingual or a multilingual context. First of all, the extent to which there's a strong focus on literacy socialization in the home. It can be in one language, it can be in multiple languages, but the more children are hearing stories read aloud, the more they're talking to parents or older siblings or whoever about books, the more that there are books around the house that they can pick up and read, the stronger their literacy skills are going to develop. We know this from an enormous amount of research. Secondly, uh, children need to develop an awareness of how language works. And that includes phonics, that includes knowledge of the alphabet, or if we're talking about Chinese cultures, knowledge of characters and how they work, how meaning is put together in print. And so developing that, drawing children's attention to how the language works, sort of the technical aspects, but doing it not in a kind of didactic way. No parent should feel that they have to sit their 3-year-old child down and say, now we're going to have a lesson on phonics and we're going to look at diphthongs. That's not how you do it. You read to the child, you get the child engaged with the book, with listening to you, with talking to you, and that's a very emotionally satisfying and important time for the child. And so books become associated with pleasure, with love, with security. And so it's in that context that we can very effectively draw children's attention to aspects of how language is put together. And then that intersects with linguistic engagement and language engagement. The more children enjoy reading, the more they'll want to read, the more they will talk to their friends about books they've read, and the more literacy will become part of their lives. And that's stimulating their creativity, that's stimulating their intellect, that's expanding their vocabulary, it's expanding their writing skills. And so it's a win-win-win situation. But there's basically those 3 major entry points or doorways that we need to take account of. Literacy socialization in the preschool years, taking every opportunity, both in the preschool years and during the school years and across the curriculum, to draw children's attention to how language works. And this can include looking at relationships across languages. For example, if we look at the word encounter in English, in Spanish, the word is encontrar, very, very similar.
Yeah.
We can talk about, okay, how did that happen? And we get back into how Latin influenced many European languages. And that's part of drawing children's attention to language, developing their language and literacy awareness. And then thirdly, making sure that there's a strong affective connection to reading so that children's literacy engagement can be maximized. And if we talk about books, if we encourage children to read books and see that as something that's a natural thing to do, that's going to fuel further engagement, and children's academic achievement will soar.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to take a few comments from our audience. There is James Anderson who is thanking you. I think it's the same for everyone, but thanking you for educating and inspiring us for so long. And then he adds about it's very sad that ideology seems to dominate the extensive and fantastic research in this area. And then he's talking about promoting storytelling, but digital storytelling, and how it can help as well. Because I guess there are many places in the world where you can't get books easily, or it takes time, or it's expensive with shipping. But having digital books can help as well in this respect. Yeah. And
if I can just jump in there and comment on that.
Yes.
That's an incredible resource that has again become accessible really only in the last 10 years or so, as the internet has expanded and it's been possible to put a lot of books in digital form up on the web, and typically these are free to access. And there's a wonderful project that was I guess initiated by a friend and colleague of mine, Bonnie Norton, in University of British Columbia, who's initially the African Storybooks project. It's now called, I think, the Global Storybooks Project, where there are a significant number of books about many topics, animals, for example, that exist in the African continent. that are accessible in multiple languages on the web. So a parent can go with his or her child and go to the web and look at these books, look at them in their home language as well as in English. So the digital storytelling environment adds another dimension to this because it's in principle accessible, even in contexts where it's very difficult to get print books in multiple languages.
Thank you very much. And yeah, just all the comments as well, that resonates a lot with what you said about so the connection that we need to create between our children and the literacy, but also their roots, and to be proud of their languages and cultures. And just we were arriving at the end of the hour, and I hope your throat is okay. Generally, in these events where there are loads of talks at the same time, there is some sort of overload where we can't. There is so much we don't know what to remember. If you had to leave 1, 2, or 3, if you want, a few key ideas you want every parent or teachers to keep in mind, to take away, what would it be?
Don't underestimate our children. I was in Iceland last week, and one of the people I spent some time with is somebody who speaks 8 different languages fluently. And so children are capable of learning many, many languages if the sociolinguistic situation is supportive of that. But it's important to think about what we're doing. It's important to have a policy. It's important to adjust that policy when necessary. It shouldn't be a coercive policy because that's going to be counterproductive. But what children need is exposure to all of the languages that we want them to learn or that they're in a position to learn. And if they're supported by both the home and the school, then they can make strong progress in more than 2 languages. And literacy is a major tool in terms of fueling that language learning trajectory and providing a lot of pleasure to children and to parents. And again, if we go back to the digital reality, having, say, a grandparent meet or grandparents meet with their grandchildren or grandchild over the web, over Zoom, or whatever the medium may be, and maybe go to one of the global storybook sites and read together in the language that is common to them. Again, that is totally possible. That's happening right now. And what part of what this implies is that there is, I think, a responsibility on the part of educators to open up these possibilities to parents. Educators have a lot more knowledge of the web than many parents do. And so if the school, when children come to register their child in the school, even if there was a 1-page handout or a little brochure saying it's really important and it's beneficial for your child cognitively and educationally to develop their home languages, here are some sites that you may want to look at to get some resources and ideas for doing this effectively. And then if there's a policy in the school that will be proactive in communicating that message to children and communicating accurate messages to parents, that's going to help a lot too. So it should be a partnership between parents and children. And that's happening in some places. The Language Friendly Schools network is a really good example, and it's an easy place to access and start this journey. But unfortunately, we're still a long way from this being normalized. And that's why the work that you're doing, Ashito, is really important in terms of bringing these issues to a wider audience.
And thank you very much for your support in this event by attending and sharing all your experience and insights you have in this. And so I'm going to leave as well the links to the Language Friendly School website and the Global Storybook Project. So I'll leave the link in the description. Thank you so much for being here and talking to us, reminding us the key things that we need to keep in mind. And yeah, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
You too. Thank you.
And for those of you who are following us, I'm going to, in 15 minutes, going to have a conclusion session about all this event, summarizing a few things. If you want to join and tell me what you enjoyed or what you're taking away, that would be great to see you there. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Cummins. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Bye.